I'm Richard Davidson, and it's really a pleasure for me to be here. I am a neuroscientist by training, and I began my career with a very simple question that still is a burning question for us today. And the question is, why is it that some people are more vulnerable to life's challenges, life's slings and arrows, and others more resilient? And in the early part of my career, I focused a lot on the adversity side of the equation, and more recently have devoted my efforts to understanding the positive side. What are the qualities that we can nurture in our minds and in our bodies that may help us to be more resilient and to flourish as human beings? The catalyst for this shift from focusing on the adversity side to focusing on the positive side came in 1992 when I first met His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama challenged me on that day in 1992, and he said, "Why can't you use the same tools of modern neuroscience that you've been using to study anxiety and depression and fear and stress? Why can't you use those same tools to study kindness and to study compassion?" And that was a wake-up call for me. And since that time, we've been pivoting much of our work toward the positive side of this equation. And this is where the study of empathy and compassion comes in. And I'll say a lot more about that in just a few minutes. Let me first begin, though, by underscoring the fact that we have an urgent need today in the world to cultivate these positive qualities. Rates of distractibility, of loneliness, of depression, of anxiety are skyrocketing in many, many countries throughout the world. There is a crisis in well-being, a failure to flourish, if you will. And we need to do everything we can to nurture these capacities and to instill in the population this idea that the qualities that underlie well-being, including empathy, are qualities that can be cultivated. They can be trained. They can be developed. They can be learned. It is not the case that we have a fixed amount of empathy or a fixed amount of kindness. Rather, these are skills that can be nurtured through training. So this perspective is a perspective that emerges from a number of important trends in modern science, and I'd like to name just a few of these. The first is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is a word that means that our brains are constantly changing. Our brains change in response to experience and in response to training. Our brains are constantly being shaped wittingly or unwittingly. And most of the time, our brains are being shaped unwittingly. Most of the time, we're unaware of the forces around us which are shaping our brain and of which we have very little control. The invitation in this work is that we can actually take more responsibility for our own brains by cultivating healthy habits of mind. So neuroplasticity is extremely important. It gives us a mechanism to understand how certain kinds of training may endure, because this kind of training may change the brain, which then underlies the enduring expression of these characteristics such as empathy and compassion. So a second really important theme in modern science, which is very germane to empathy, is what we call innate basic goodness. Every human being is born into the world with innate basic goodness. And what we mean by this is that we all have a propensity for pro-social behavior, for altruism, for caring. This is something that is part of our biology. The way scientists have discovered this is primarily by studying infants very early in life. And we can see that if infants within the first 6 months of life are given a choice about whether to watch a cooperative, warm-hearted, pro-social encounter versus one that is selfish and aggressive, the infants clearly show a very strong preference for the pro-social. More than 90% of infants prefer to view interactions that are pro-social compared to ones that are anti-social. And this can be discerned very, very early in life before a whole lot of learning has occurred. And so this is what gives us the evidence to suggest that there may be this quality of innate basic goodness. Now, empathy is a characteristic which also is present from birth, at least in its rudimentary forms. We know that infants, neonates, newborn infants, respond to the cry of other infants. There is research which demonstrates that if a baby in a neonatal ICU begins to cry, there is an increased likelihood that other babies in the vicinity will also cry. These are the early roots of empathy, this kind of emotional mimicry, which can be discerned very, very early in life. Now, one of the exciting developments in this area of affective or emotional neuroscience and contemplative neuroscience, neuroscience of practices that come from ancient contemplative traditions that are designed to nourish our mind and our heart, is that we are beginning to understand the key elements of well-being. And what are these key elements of well-being? I'd like to share these with you because they are germane to our understanding of empathy and compassion. We have delineated a framework for understanding well-being that holds that there are 4 key elements, each of which exhibit plasticity. What we mean by that is each can be trained through certain kinds of practices and nourished, cultivated. So these 4 key pillars of well-being are the following. The first pillar we call awareness. This is where we would put mindfulness, our capacity to regulate our attention, and our ability to know what our mind is doing. So important. Distractibility is toxic for our well-being. The second pillar of well-being is the pillar that is intimately concerned with both empathy and compassion. And this is the pillar we call connection. Connection is about the qualities which are important for healthy social relationships. These qualities include empathy, appreciation, gratitude, kindness, compassion. All of them are part of this pillar that we call connection. And I'll come back to this pillar and take a deeper dive in just a couple of moments. I want to share with you the other 2 pillars of well-being. I've talked about awareness. I've talked about connection. The third pillar of well-being we call insight. And insight is about knowing what our minds are actually doing. Now, that may seem strange to some people. Don't we always know what our minds are doing? But how many of you have had the experience of reading a book where you may be reading each word on a page, and you read one page, you may read a second page, and then after a few minutes, you recognize that you have no idea what you've just read? That's an example of our minds being lost. That is an example of a lapse of awareness. And so this quality is so important for our well-being. So with insight, knowing what our minds are doing, there are people who hold beliefs about what is going on in their mind. They may not be aware of these beliefs, but yet these beliefs are shaping how they perceive reality, their understanding of the world. There are people at one extreme who hold very negative beliefs about themselves. They have low self-esteem, for example. And we know that if they take those beliefs to be a true description of who they are, that's a prescription for depression. So applying meta-awareness, knowing what our minds are doing, and having insight into the nature of the thoughts and expectations and beliefs that shape our mind, that can be very liberating and can free us from the constraints that are imposed by these beliefs and expectations. So that is insight. And finally, the last pillar of well-being we call purpose. And purpose is about finding our true north, our sense of direction in life, and aligning more and more of our everyday behavior around this sense of purpose. And we know that having a strong sense of purpose is the single most important psychological predictor of longevity in the later years of life. So these qualities make a real difference, not only for our psychological well-being, but also for our physical health. Now let's return to connection and to empathy and compassion, which is at the root of our dialogue today. Scientists have discovered that when a person is empathizing with another person, they take on the feelings of that other person. So let's say that I am empathizing with a person who is in pain. Well, it turns out that if I am a skillful empathizer and show a lot of empathy, then the brain circuits in my brain that are associated with pain also activate. This is how we can feel the emotions of another, which is part of empathy. And so scientists have conducted research that has allowed them to discover this. We know a lot about the circuits in the brain that are important, for example, for physical pain. And we know exactly where to look in the brain to examine these circuits. And so scientists have discovered that when a person is empathizing with another person who is in pain, the empathizer exhibits changes in his or her brain that are similar to the changes in the brain of the person who's really in pain. And so their pain circuits, the empathizer's pain circuits, also begin to activate. They begin to light up. Now, this is very different than the pattern of brain activity that we see in compassion. Compassion, unlike empathy, is the disposition to help relieve the suffering of another. And so this is a pattern which has been, a process which has been studied actively by scientists, particularly over the last 10 years. And there are specific and simple practices from the contemplative traditions of the East that have been studied that are designed to cultivate empathy and compassion. And these practices, particularly the practices that are designed to cultivate empathy and compassion, teach us about the different brain mechanisms associated with each. So what we see when a person is practicing cultivating compassion is that brain circuits that are associated with positive emotion are activated, and also brain circuits associated with action are activated. Compassion is very much a preparation to act when suffering is encountered. And so one of the implications of this work is that we can begin to think about how empathy and compassion are connected. In order to empathize with a person who is suffering, we need to feel some of the emotions that that person is feeling. And that is a precursor for compassion. It's difficult for us to express compassion to relieve the suffering of another unless we have some sense of what that suffering is. And so empathy is a process, quality that can help inform us about the suffering of another. And then we can use the signals that we derive from empathy and transform that into compassion to then help relieve that suffering in another. And this is where the neuroscience evidence is so interesting, because we see that the networks in the brain that are associated with action are activated during compassion. And that is because compassion is a state which is preparing a person to act as soon as suffering is encountered. So this is a really significant insight from the contemplative traditions, and it leads us to develop strategies to help people, particularly people who are in the helping professions, who often talk about compassion burnout. We think it's more appropriate to think of this actually as empathy burnout. And if we can help people to transform empathy into compassion, this will be, we think, very beneficial, because when people are generating compassion, circuits in the brain that are associated with positive emotion are activated. It actually feels good to help another. And in that way, it's very nourishing rather than depleting. So to step back and take a broader view, I've talked about, and to summarize, I've talked about 4 pillars of well-being, each of which can be cultivated. The first is awareness. The second is connection. The third is insight. And the fourth is purpose. Each of these pillars can be strengthened through simple kinds of practice. And we've discovered that it doesn't take much to get all of this going. And particularly the qualities associated with connection, qualities like empathy and appreciation and compassion, can easily be nurtured because we are pro-social at our roots from the beginning. And so scientific research shows that even a few minutes of practice to nurture these qualities is sufficient to produce a change in objective measures of behavior and of biology. Humans, when we first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. Yet, I'm sure everyone who's watching this brushes their teeth for at least a few minutes a day. This is not part of our genome. This is something we've all learned to do because it's important for our personal physical hygiene. The cultivation of empathy and compassion is important for our personal mental hygiene. And if we spend even as short a time as we spend brushing our teeth, nourishing our mind and our heart in these ways, we have the very strong conviction that the world would be a very different place. Our center has an associated nonprofit that has developed an app that includes all of these 4 pillars of well-being. You can learn more about it by going to the website tryhealthyminds.org. And you can download this free app, which is available all over the world. You can learn that we can engage in simple practices for just a few minutes a day to nurture qualities like empathy and compassion.